Okay, there we go. Thank you for that. And on to the meat of the session. We'll talk with the four experts about the key documents needed for a successful transition to manufacturing to build your prototype or production. Let me open up maybe with being a little contrarian. Ask all the panelists, do startups really need documents when they can explain what they need on a phone call or on a Zoom call? What would you see as the downsides to doing that? Because I know people are averse to writing things down in many cases. So, John, perhaps let's start with you on that. Do they really need documents when they come and talk to potential partners and manufacturers?
Well, I think when you consider the old adage that if it isn't written down, it didn't happen. You really need to make sure that you in order to have control over what product is produced, you want to have documents that are outlining certainly the design of it, but also the business relationship between the companies, just so that everybody can be on the same page. We live and die by the documentation, either in our QMS system or in our quality, for quality. The prints that we send out to subcontractors to get components made, those are the things that define what it is and how we can judge whether it meets the requirements. So it's critical to have enough documentation that you can clearly define to everybody who looks at it exactly what you're looking for.
Okay, thanks, John. Chris, what's your thoughts? Do you come across people who try and communicate verbally with you?
We do. We have people who are inventors and one-off, single folks, and they don't know, and so we have to educate them, hold their hand through the process. And I echo what John says, because for us, we take it from inception up until we hand it off to a contract manufacturer and that type of thing. And so, we would be doing a disservice not only to our client, but to whoever we're handing it off to if we didn't have any type of documentation. I can pretty much tell you, I would say 100% of the people that we would hand it off to would balk and say, we're not doing this until we have documentation, because they don't work off of that. So, and they don't want to be responsible for something that's just kind of like an idea floating in the air. So I would say that for any individual or group that is obviously working on development of anything, pure documentation for patents, anything that's going to prove that this is your idea, this is how we want it, and being able to refer back to it in case something goes wrong. I can possibly get into it later. I just had a meeting right before this very specifically about that, so I can use that as a very up-to-date example. So.
Stop.
Mike, from your perspective, do you deal with companies who want to avoid documentation, and what's your reaction?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, and as a startup, you have limited resources, and you can only do so much, right? And know so much about what the whole process is all about. And so you learn as you go what you're lacking. And so so whatever you try to focus on, you want to try to get quality information that's accurate as much as and make a list as you go along of what documents that you will have to develop further, because a lot of times you have a product idea and you have good documentation on that, but you don't have contract information, NDAs, and other operational type documentation. But if you have it on a list, that you have to, when you have time, develop those. So depending on what step you're in, what stage you're in, focus on those documentation first, instead of trying to do everything at once that doesn't have the accuracy and the depth that you need.
Right. Does that resonate with you and Kalo and the work you've been doing, Nick?
Absolutely. I can only echo what the other panelists have said. Documentation is what everybody delivers to. You can't go in with an expectation of X and expect Y. If it's not on the document, if it's not on the controlled paperwork, you can't expect a delivery that isn't controlled.
Right.
That doesn't mean, Paul, that the startup company has to generate all of that documentation. I mean, there are our engineering group, when we bring startup companies in, we're doing quite a bit of the documentation. They still need to approve it and understand what it means, but we have to have the processes under control. So
Right.
you can get help to get that documentation generated. You know, non-disclosure agreements. I mean, we've got mutual non-disclosure agreements that you just fill out. So it's not like you've got to go hire an attorney and have it drawn up from whole cloth. They're pretty standard. Maybe you should have an attorney look at it though, to look out for your interest rate. But a lot of that stuff is very boilerplate. And a lot of the documentation has standards that need to be met, questions that, you know, answers to questions. So
yeah, let's. I mean, I think everybody agrees that documentation is vital to a successful project. So maybe we'll pick up, you know, that point, and you know, let's try and step through the documents that you needed. I mean, I think the opening document would be like a non-disclosure document, John, which you touched upon then. And you know, when you engage with a client, are you always expecting a non-disclosure agreement? And is that something you produce? Is that something you'd expect the client, or is it vary?
So when we're first introduced to a client, and in a lot of cases, you know, Paul, you guys do a great job with that introduction. That's one of the first questions that I bring up is we can only talk so much without an NDA being put in place. That, you know, getting down into the real weeds of what the product does and the technical details. I prefer to have an NDA in place so that everybody's comfortable about sharing the information. And, you know, we have a template that we can fill out. Most of the time, I would say that a startup company has their own non-disclosure agreement that they've gotten from somebody. And we're happy to work with that because, like I said, they're pretty standard. I mean, there's some terms that vary, but it covers the same basis.
Right, Chris, is that your experience that typically people come to you with an NDA in place, or if they do, is it sufficient, or do you tend to find you don't have it and need to be advised?
Yeah, most have it, especially, you know, the larger companies, of course, you know, with the individuals and that type of thing. Some don't even know what it is. And so, again, you educate them in regards to that. It's obviously for their protection and for our protection as well. But as John said, the comfortability of being able to talk about the project and the application itself. And so it is one of the very first things that we talk about when we are thinking. Certainly, you can have that 30,000 foot, you know, look at what the project is, but my first two questions are, okay, so tell me what it is, and before you tell me what it is, do you need an NDA in place? So I, even when they say no, we don't, or I have a patent pending, I said, okay, that's you know, totally up to you, but you know, I would advise that it's just good to have in place. It doesn't cost anything, and you know, it's there. So
yeah. I mean, I'd reiterate also, you know, manufacturers and suppliers and contract manufacturers are not really in the same business as the startup. So, you know, it's an unlikely scenario, but it's definitely worth making sure that information is held confidentially by both parties, because there may even be process elements that a particular supplier or manufacturer is using that is confidential to them. So a mutual non-disclosure is generally best. So if you've got to that point and you've had some discussion about what a product is, and maybe this question perhaps for you, Nick, you know, what would at that point, would you typically expect a startup to come with a formal request for quotation, some kind of a document that outlines what they want, that you would then price and both cost-wise and also timeframe delivery against?
So it comes back to what Mike was alluding to earlier, it really depends on that stage of the startup, right? Are they in a alpha stage, a beta stage? Are they in a pre-production launch? Are they in a production launch? So you really have to see what stage they're at and feel out where they are in their development themselves. And then go from there and then discuss with the startup what their expectations are and then work from there.
So the RFQ could be informal in terms of a broad document that describes rough, kind of the outlines of what they want, or it could be more detailed at that point, rather than necessarily just being high level. Would you expect an RFQ to include quantity and timeline and requirements like that at that point, or would it still be a fairly generic?
So anything that's timeline and quantity based is always helpful, because we don't know if you're looking for one a year or one a day. And that puts context to resources, labor, space, footage, and requirements on my end. So
for ICSN, Mike, is that something that do most companies that come to you quickly get to the RFQ type stage, or documentation defining what the requirements are, or do they, is that a fairly iterative process between you both?
Yeah, sure. I mean, like Nick said, if it's an established company, then they already know, what they want, when they want it, and so that's pretty straightforward. But when you're talking concept stage, any kind of even verbal type communication, then it eventually has to turn into a quote. So whatever information that you can provide will help to get a more realistic quote in terms of time frame and cost, because the more requirements you put on the front end, that helps to vet everything out. Like, okay, can we even handle this project? Are you ready for the delays and what the true scope of the time frame is? So you work all that out, and so you try to get to that stage of, okay, here's the proposal, and so it'll be a back and forth iterative process. And so, but at that stage, then the startup has to understand, all the parameters of what that quote is saying.
Right. I mean, that kind of, maybe makes us go back a little bit, which is, Nick and John, you might be best to answer this. What stage does a startup need to have reached, or a company need to have reached, before engaging with a contract manufacturer? How do they assess themselves? How do they, clearly they need more than a paper napkin. They need some kind of a prototype, presumably. But, how would they assess, what are you looking for to assess whether you want to spend time with somebody? How do you determine how far they have progressed and whether it's sufficient? John, perhaps starting with you on that.
All right. So kind of depends upon the scope of what they're looking for. If they believe that they're ready to go into production, they'll have a full set of documentation, and we'll take a look at it and we can just quote it. It's more typical that they'll show up with maybe some beta prototypes, and they are functional. There's a few design changes that they still have to do to release something that would be suitable for production. That's probably where we would want to get involved, because we could also look at that and suggest some changes for manufacturing, because to pick a contract manufacturer, the manufacturer's processes have to be suitable to build the product. So it's always good to get to know someone when they still have some design decisions to make sure that it's suitable for your manufacturing processes.
Right.
And, they could come as early as an alpha prototype. And but in that case, they're not really expecting us to give them a quote to go off and build thousands of them, but just to kind of meet and steer them in the direction based upon how much tooling should they be thinking about based upon the volume that they eventually want to produce. What kind of budget are they going to need to be able to get into manufacturing, very early in the process, I think it's easier to kind of scope that out, and it allows them to make decisions on the style of the design. Do they really want $400,000 worth of injection molded parts tooling in order to launch the first 50? Maybe they'll change their design methods to something more suitable to their budget in that case.
Nick, do you expect people to show up with CAD files and drawings and design documentation when you first engage with them?
So obviously, anything that they show up with earlier is better. It produces a product faster. But again, depending upon the startup, and the realization of time, and being realistic, like Mike alluded to a couple of minutes ago. Some startups show up and say, here's my design. It's like you alluded to, Paul, a sketch on a napkin, and I have some drawings, and I want to be in production in 30 days. It's a great concept, but it's not reality. So you go back and you say, hey, we really need drawings, we need builds of material, we need CAD files, and you're really looking at 6 months before we build 5. I know it's a huge upsetting discussion, but that's reality. So then you build the 5, and then they launch the 5, and they get feedback on their 5, and then perhaps they build 25 or 50 or 100. So it's a vicious cycle of getting feedback to the startup, then startup to the field back to the startup, then startup to the contract manufacturer, and it's a loop. So they go alpha, beta, production, and they build from 50 pieces to 100 pieces to 1,000 pieces.
I mean, Chris, you're particularly active in the 3D printing environment. I would assume there that you everybody is already designed a document, has a CAD file ready to share with you. Is that sort of part of the process?
There's a high percentage of the clients that we work with already are presenting CAD to us already. We do have design engineering in-house, and so we definitely get those folks who need that help. They have an idea, they have not been sketched, as you said before, and then they need help with that. So, but for most of the clients, they already have CAD. And to echo back to the question about how much information do we need, as much information as feasibly possible, because it really comes down to what is the process, what is the material, what is the quantity, what is the finish, the CMF of what you're going to be doing. Do they need all of that? Because it all affects the price of what's going to happen. So we could, assuming is bad, because we could assume something and then we'll quote it and be pricing it out the door, and they're like, I only wanted you to print it. So it's our job, and it's my job in the sales to narrow those things, those necessary needs from the client for that particular process. They might have 3 or 4 different stages. Maybe they just want something right away. And then they'll move to something that's more refined, and then they'll move into something that's pre-production, and that type of thing. So, you really need all that information in order to give an accurate assessment to your clients or potential clients. Of course, I would suspect they're also going to other companies too to get quotes, and so the more information we have, hopefully we're quoting apples to apples, or we're doing our job and the other company's not, and that's why we get the job. So there's a lot of factors involved when we talk to our clients to make sure that they're getting what they want, they're getting what they paid for, and we give them the best parts that we can.
Yeah, you touched upon something there where designs are not necessarily completely set. I mean, Mike, would you expect that there's a fair bit of kind of back and forth where you're actually helping a startup develop and refine their product, so that not only does it something you can work with, but it perhaps makes it easier to produce, makes it lower cost, whatever. Is that part of the process you would typically engage in?
Definitely. That's the whole definition of a startup. You're developing a product that doesn't exist, or you have an advantage of something. And so the whole idea of taking that product to something that that will make your company succeed is about, you know, making sure that the design is sound, that what you have on concept really can turn into reality. But sometimes they go down this path because they're not experts in design in all the areas, and so they have a concept that they develop. Some people put a lot of time and resources into full CAD development of this idea without looking at all the other ramifications down the road, like manufacturability, serviceability, reliability. You know, there's so many disciplines involved that they're now committed to that design. And so then it's hard to interject new ideas or changes to that to make it more affordable and less time, less schedule wise. And so if they need to be able to be open to that kind of interaction with anybody, and the more they have input at the early stages, it's just going to save them in the long run. And so I'd rather have somebody come with a napkin sketch concept than a fully developed concept, because you know that they don't have the right resources to fully develop the idea, unless it is a large company that already has, you know, an engineering department and they've gotten outside consulting. But if you're at that real true early stage, open it up for discussion.
Yeah, I think that's an important point. I mean, certainly contract manufacturers all, or generally at least, have a fair amount of in-house design capability. And I think the role for them is to help companies progress their development. And if you've got something that's set in stone, that's great. But you can also leverage suppliers and manufacturers who are doing this day in, day out, and have teams and expertise that can help you make the right design choices.
And I would even echo again what Mike has said. Even if you think you've nailed down a process, listen to your CM and say, I know I spent $100,000 on tooling, but if the CM is saying, if you consider this operation or this different process, maybe investing another $100,000 in tooling saves you in the long run.
Yeah. Right. And like Chris said, people have to have a very good CAD model to make, solid, 3D printed parts and other rapid, prototyping. But if as a true design of the whole product, you may get that perfect part, but it may not fit into the pre-production or mass production model, because you can't make everything that you can 3D print. I mean, there's a lot of parts that you can print, and the young engineers are notorious for that. If you can print it, then that's the end of that. So you can only go so far with, your concepts. You have to get more input, a lot of input up at the early stage.
And if I could add one more thing to this, there's also the issue of regulatory compliance. Even if you've got the most serviceable, easily manufacturable product, if you need to sell it into a market that requires CE marking or UL so you can plug it into the wall, and you need to think about all of the additional requirements that are being put on the product from the market, and all the testing that you've got to go through so that you can make sure that your design is going to pass all of those tests. Because if you get into manufacturing with it and then send it out for regulatory approval, you're going to have a whole bunch of design changes that you've got to implement in the middle of a manufacturing run. And that is far more expensive than getting them nailed down in, say, the beta prototype stage.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Paul, let me also, I'll use a quick example. So you're right. We do use additive or 3D printing for low volume production. When we get this question all the time, so we'll design something and help them design something that works great for additive, and they are able to use it, and they do what they want. And then they come back and say, well, we want more, we want to lower the cost. And we said, okay, well, that's fine. But we designed it for additive. We didn't design it for, injection molding. So we have to go back and they say, well, why didn't you do that? I said, because that's not what you asked for. And you said you only needed 50 of these. If the discussion had said that you were forecasting for 1,000 of these and stuff like that, then that's discussion we would have to have a twofold discussion, one to get you product right away and one that's going to extend. Maybe that 3D printing might do that and that might work. Some people don't want to put out the money, as John was saying before, for $400,000 worth of tooling, maybe because their product is not going to support that and it doesn't need it. And maybe 3D printing will actually be able to support it all the way through the whatever they're trying to do.
Right.
So, these are part of all the discussions that you have to have with people, and everybody who's here, you have to be forthwith. You can't hold back a little bit. I mean, because we can't help you if you're not really giving us the whole shebang in regards to how you want to move forward. So, and sometimes you don't know. But that's the time to do pie in the sky type of stuff and discussions so that all that information is out on the table.
Yeah, I think that leads into, at some point you've got a definition of what you think you want and you've signed an NDA. Probably have an idea of the cost, but would the next stage then be, to document a statement of work? Is that the typical next stage when you kind of are actually putting together the specifics of what's needed? Mike, can I ask you that question? Would a statement of work be the sort of key element in the process?
Yeah, definitely a statement or scope of work document is very crucial, because then that defines, who's responsible for what at what stage. Because it's not just one-sided. Statement of work is, okay, if you get to this stage, then the customer has to understand whether that stage is sufficient for what they need at that point, or do you need to make changes, because it's a back and forth process. So you have to allow the various stages so that you can refine the product. But every time you do that, as long as you have a starting document, now okay, if we make this change, then this scope will change. We call that scope creep, to where it's bound to happen on new products. But if you don't document it as a scope in the initial stages, then it becomes very, very muddy in terms of who's doing what, and what are you really responsible for, and what are you getting charged for. So that way you clearly understand every stage along the way.
Right. And Nick, picking up Chris's comment, would the statements of work be where you would, where somebody would highlight that whilst we're doing this now, we're 3D printing it perhaps, but that we want to go to injection molding or other changes? Would that be included in the statement of work, or is that kind of potential change documented somewhere else?
So the statement of work is typically a live document, like Mike was just alluding to. It is always creeping. It's always changing, especially now since COVID. Components they're everywhere. Lead times have gone from 8 and 10 weeks up to a year or more. We have one customer who delivers a key component that goes into every one of my units. So in their statement of work, it says, I'm going to produce X. Well, contingent upon that is them providing me with that key component. So I can't deliver X if they don't supply their key component. So you can't hold me liable for that if it's not them supplying me with that key part. So yes, if we're going to make the first 100 components with a 3D printed part, and then after, say, the 100 to 1,000 is made with an injection molded part, and then perhaps after 1,000 we look for hard tooling instead of soft tooling. There's all kinds of variables to the statement of work.
Right. Would would the statement of work go hand in hand with the with a quotation? Is that the point where you're able to define, yes, this is what's needed, and so at this stage we'll be able to price a project?
Absolutely.
Right, right. I think, you know, I think I'd reiterate the point about back and forth. I mean, you know, I'm a strong believer that a manufacturer or a supplier needs to be a partner. And so, you know, you need to share with them not just what you plan to do now, but going forward, so they can understand that and contribute to that design. So, you know, and I know that's the you know, what any good supplier would do. But John, maybe a question for you would be, you know, how should a startup, probably building their first product, you know, how should they think about potential partners? You know, what should they be looking to assess? How do they determine who's good, who's bad, and you know, what research they should be undertaking?
Well, I think that visiting the facility and seeing the manufacturing operation firsthand is an excellent way to understand who it is that you're working with. Look at the type of products that they're developing. We tend to do electronic instrumentation, industrial controls, stuff like that. Other companies might be more into consumer electronics and super high volume, where we're more of a low volume, high mix group. So different manufacturers are going to fit with different types of products.
Mm-hmm.
And visit them, meet their engineering team, get an idea, get them to look at your product and explain how they would process it and how they would bring it through the process so they could ship it in what kind of volumes. I think look at their quality systems. Do they have any third-party recognition like ISO 9001? Or if you're doing medical devices, ISO 13485 is always a good one to have. Of course, in the US, it's really 21 CFR 820, but that's not a standard, that's the law. So it's a little bit different. But get an idea of how serious they are about quality and what types of products they build, and make sure that that kind of fits in with your vision of what your product is.
Mm-hmm. Chris, what's your perspective on that? What you know, what should they be looking for, you know, when they're looking to partner?
Yeah, well, we kind of have a very broad fan, because again, we get the individuals, we also get the companies and that type of thing, and we also service a lot of different industries, medical, consumer product, aerospace, et cetera. So I do agree, having them come in and take a look at your facility. You can give them all of the flashy pamphlets you want, but it's not until they actually come in and see what's going on, tangibly being able to touch some things and talk to some of the people who are working there, either the project managers, the designers, that type of thing, to give them an understanding of what our competency is. I think doing your due diligence and homework, as John had mentioned, about making sure of what type of quality controls you have, is becoming the standard, to understanding that a company is willing to go through these processes to make sure that there's consistency and reliability within the organization that will produce a part that you're looking for, and a company that you can go back to. Reliability and loyalty is obviously what we're looking for. We want the repeat customer. We want them to come back to us, and that reputation obviously gets filtered out to, you know, not only the clients and everything, but also within the groups that we're talking with now, with Nick and John and Mike. You know, that gets pushed out to them, and then they talk to other people and they refer. So it's a large spider web of networking, basically.
Yeah. Picking that up then, Nick, how does quality get injected? Is it part of the statement of work? Would you expect a separate quality agreement? You know, how would a supplier and a startup typically interact to ensure that the quality is going to be what's expected, by both parties. Do you see that as a separate stage, or is that handled as part of the statement of work?
So I haven't seen it built into the initial statements of work, but typically we build it in as part of the units that we produce. Like, hey, we're going to build these units. Bigger companies, they do have it as part of their statement of work, but not startups. I'm not sure if it's based upon the nature of startups, like they don't have the experience and the wherewithal, but we are ISO 9001. So we say, hey, these are good standard practices that you should follow. These are things that we should implement into your product. And traditionally they grab a hold and say, hey, yes, we're going to do that. And these are things that we're going to implement. And these are things that we're going to put in, and this is how it's going to be delivered.
Okay. Mike, where would you see things like testing requirements and inspection procedures and quality control? How does that, how does that get agreed part of a process?
Well, depending on what kind of product, or is it a single product or a system? If it's a whole system, then there's a whole procedure of how and what to test and schedule wise. Typically, as a startup, you don't know. There are some key components or key factors that has to work in a certain way, so you can document those requirements up front. But in terms of all the little parts that combine to make that product, now you're falling back on the detailed specifications of detailed drawings. You start simple with just the basic, what's the size, what's the material, but then you need to develop, okay, what are the tolerances, what are the standards, what are the requirements, of form, fit, and function. And so you can't do all that up front, but eventually before you get to the final product, you have to develop those standards. So you need a either on a very specific drawing document, you need all of the paint specs, finish specs, material specs, dimensional specs. So you need to get to that stage before you can approve or reject a certain part or process. Without that, everything's up in the air. You don't know whether the supplier met your specifications. They don't know what you wanted in the first place. So it's very key that you have to write it down. You need to have that. But then there are some qualitative quality standards that are very subjective, right? Detailed drawings are very specific. It almost nails down, if you put enough specifications into it, what the finish is, how it should look, and all that. But in terms of overall system, well, give you an example. Some recent customer ordered a custom demo trailer. There was very few specifications, and so based on how they wrote it up, we could have delivered a U-Haul, right, as a demo trailer, and it would have satisfied the requirements. But we knew what the function of this trailer was going to be, so we asked the questions. Well, do you want plywood walls or with studs showing, or do you want aluminum siding all around with finished flooring? So those are the kind of quality type specifications that you need to nail down if you expect to get what you wanted out of the final product.
Right. Yeah. So that I think that builds upon the message that working closely with your partners so that they, both parties understand exactly what is required is important. But you also need to document it so that it's there, so you can look back at it and make sure that everybody is in compliance. The last kind of area of documentation I wanted to touch upon is what I would broadly class as sort of legal stuff. Purchase orders, documents around warranties, indemnifications, things like that, and touching upon intellectual property and who owns it. John, when you're at the point where you're comfortable with understanding what somebody wants building, you understand who's responsible for supplying elements of it, and you're looking for a purchase order as before you proceed. Is that a document that you have a standard document for yourselves, or does that come from the client? How does that get together, and how do things like warranties and indemnifications fit into that?
Well, the purchase order that's something that the startup or your customer is going to be writing up and sending to you. And what we'll do is we'll put together a quotation based upon the RFQ, which will have all of the terms. It'll have statements about warranty. It'll have a scope of work detailing exactly what the product is. It will point to whatever documentation we were given that defines what the product is. If it was a medical device, it would be the device master record. And then a standard purchase order works very well. It references the quotation that we sent out, which kind of details as accurately as we can exactly what we're going to deliver, when we're going to deliver, and under what terms. And I think most of the business that we do is on that purchase order basis. If you're going to be going into volume manufacturing over multiple years, so you want to order 1,000 pieces over 12 months, let's say, sometimes a purchase order will work just fine, but at other times you'll want to put together a manufacturing agreement because you're going to want continuous production over multiple years. And it's an advantage to the contract manufacturer if they can be going out and making commitments to material and scheduling that material in over a year, 15 months. And then as production is moving, they can continually order more material at economic order quantities. That allows you to pull material in, push material out, depending upon the demand. And it makes the whole process run a lot smoother. If you think of, getting a product into a manufacturing company and in their process, it's like getting a train started. It takes a long time to get it up to speed. Once it's up to speed, you want to leave it there and you want it just to continue. Procurement comes in, is assembled, tested, calibrated, all the documentation is done, and then it's shipped. And you want that to be continuous. That's when you would typically go with a manufacturing agreement, which lays out those terms. And then you can work off of a forecast. We're going to need 25 of them in the next 60 days. And then, every month you would give, 60 days from now, we're going to want 50 of them so that the manufacturer can kind of keep up with your demand.
Nick, is that part of your standard process to look for a manufacturing agreement that goes beyond the immediate purchase orders?
Yeah, I'm going to echo what John said pretty close. What we've talked about in the last 30 minutes, 40 minutes, if we can develop a statement of work, bill of materials, a drawing package, and we can put a quotation to it. I'm just going to hold up a stack of papers here blindly and say, this is what we're going to put a purchase order to. And this is what we're going to say is our purchase order. And this is what defines it. We're going to build 25 pieces and we're going to deliver it. That's going to be pretty boilerplate. And that's what we're going to clip the binder to and say, here you go, we're going to deliver that. And it's going to cost X. And both the contract, both the customer or the startup and us, we agree to that. That's right. The story. We're going to deliver that in 60 days, 90 days, 120 days, whatever it is. The manufacturing agreement is more long-term, whether we're going to work 6 months, a year, 18 months, 5 years, 10 years, whatever we happen to agree with. And like John said, whether we're going to produce 100 a month, 200 a month, 500 a month, whatever the number is. And then we are going to look for some type of long-term commitment with forecasts and variability in the forecasts and commitments, and the contract gets pretty in-depth on the customer side and on our side for variable purposes, for their benefit and for our benefit. And like John touched on, it benefits us because we get control over the material, and it benefits them because they get volume discounts on the material coming in, because we can leverage suppliers across many variables on whether it's motors or sheet metal or machine components or hardware, because now you're buying in bulk, which
Right.
is fantastic.
Yeah. So one last area I just wanted to touch upon, which I know is a very sensitive area, particularly from startup businesses, is intellectual property. The ownership. You've had an NDA up front, but there is perhaps intellectual property created during the engagement, such as who owns the rights to it and how it can be used going forward. Chris, is that something you see in your environment? And if so, how do you handle that intellectual property going forward?
All the time. And yeah, it's definitely a discussion that we have with our clients. They own everything. Within the agreements that we have with the NDA, specifically, they're going to give us an NDA, we're going to review it, and we're going to sign it, understanding that, yes, that is the thing. I can tell you, we would not be in business anymore if we're stealing someone's IP. So it makes obviously sense for us to understand that. And we don't want to get into any of that type of stuff. It's very sensitive, obviously, and our clients are coming to us for integrity, as well as getting good parts. So we take it very seriously and make sure that they understand that their ideas, everything is theirs, and they can walk away with it. Now, that being said, there are some processes that we do that are exclusive to us, and we let them know if they're using those that they can't take the mold with them. Once the mold is done and it can't be then we destroy it. So then obviously their IP is protected that way. But again, I'm not going to dive into a bunch of stuff, but that's basically what we go through with them. So,
Right, but yeah, most startups don't understand the full ramifications of what IP really means, and depending on how much the supplier or the contract manufacturer helped them in the design process, you get into gray areas, and so legally they don't have to turn over drawings, design data. They can give you the part, but it's like when you go to an architect. You can have them build your house, but they own this, they own the plans, and so you have to have the discussions up front. Do you want the drawings? Do you want all the CAD data? Do you want all So you have to clearly spell that out. Otherwise, you're going to be fighting for that. At the later stages when you want to make changes on your own and develop further.
Yeah, I think that's the point I wanted to get to, that you do need to think about that, because there is often intellectual property created as part of the process, or it's owned by the contract manufacturer that's being used. So, both parties need to be familiar, understand what the expectation is down the line for the intellectual property and the drawings and the designs that are used to build the product. Well, we're very tight on time, like any good business. We're trying to squeeze too much into too little time, but I do want to quickly open the floor for questions, and I think there was one that Stan had asked earlier, which I wanted to touch upon, which is, how do you define a production launch, or what is the stage just before production launch? And he's specific here to a pre-manufacturing prototype. Stan, do you want to come off mute and just kind of clarify what you're thinking here and see if we can get an answer for you? Can he take himself? Maybe he can't take himself off mute. Do you want to unmute people, Gracie? Stan, you still here? No, we seem to have lost Stan. Okay. But maybe that question, what do you guys define as sort of pre-prototype and prototype? Is that a volume a volume issue, or is it to do with the stage of the process? Chris, I saw you nodding your head.
Well, some people's prototypes are some people's production. I mean, so it's tough to define. It's all up to individual or company in regards to what that is, but I would say, we have some people that 10, that's their production. And then there's other people that are, obviously 100,000 is their production and 10 is the prototype. So it's hard to define, but I would say it's, I don't know where to go from that. I mean, it's a variable. I mean, it's there, that terminology of what is pre-production, what is bridge tooling, what is all that type of stuff. I guess it is in volume, but it all depends on each company.
I think it might be a little bit more clear, like if you think of a case of a medical device company, there are certain validation steps that you have to go through before you can put the product into the market. So everything that is built before you do that final validation, those are prototypes and they can't be sold as normal product. They might be used for demos or something, but they're not suitable for sale into the market. After you finish all the validation work, and the validation is you've got to go through the design reviews, and then you go through at least a pilot production so that the manufacturing process can be validated. And then you go through a validation to demonstrate that the product as produced by the contract manufacturer does the job that the marketing information says it does. Then you can release it, and that's your production launch. It's clear under those terms, and you can think if you treat your product just like that, you want to make sure that the product is doing what you say it's going to do before you actually start selling it to real customers, as opposed to sliding one over to some guy who's going to test your beta for you. That's not the real production. The real production is when you're ready to sell it to everybody. And that is, it's kind of dependent upon what the startup's looking for, not so much what the contract manufacturer is looking for. They can build them and you can decide to sell them or decide that they're prototypes.
Right. A couple of other questions here. Russell, you'd asked about crowdfunding. I'm not sure if that's part of it. It's not really a documentation question, and I'm not sure whether the suppliers, contract manufacturers get involved in that. I'd be happy to talk about that separately, unless anybody jumps, anybody wants to comment on crowdfunding from the panel.
Not so, well, I mean, we help people who are getting into that, but I mean, just developing things, but as a company, we don't necessarily, join together with somebody to do something.
Sure. And then a final question from somebody who hasn't given their name, iPhone 2. They asked if we could elaborate the steps between alpha and beta prototypes. What's the distinction? I think Chris and John, you may have covered that to some extent, but is there any hard distinction, or is it really just a function of how far progressed the design is towards its final version? Mike or Nick, perhaps you have some thoughts on alpha versus beta? Mike, perhaps?
I'll take a stab. So in my history, you build your first prototype, and great, I've made a prototype. I know that it works, it functions, it meets my design spec. Your alpha is the first one that you put to a customer. They touch it, they feel it, they love it, they provide you feedback. Now you build some beta units, and you've either refined based on the feedback or you haven't. So now you're giving some additional upgrades to your unit, and you're doing either more quantity or the same quantity. It doesn't matter on quantity. And now you're launching another soft launch, so to speak, with a beta unit, and hopefully providing some type of upgrade based upon your alphas.
Right.
Yep.
Would you expect to engage as a contract manufacturer at an alpha stage, or would you be, I think it would be beta before they would typically be engaging with you?
I have in both cases, alphas or betas.
Interesting.
I think John had something.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, we've engaged with people with alpha or betas, but the alphas, the way I usually design it is those are prototypes that are doing a proof of concept for the risky parts of the product development. You want to make sure that you can make that measurement, or you can hit those speeds, or whatever the product needs to do, that your design is suitable to hit those. And you might have multiple alphas for different parts of the design, depending upon how complex it is. When you go to the beta prototype, that's where you're trying to put everything together, including the human factors like the user interface and exactly how it's going to look and feel. And you may not hit that, you might need another iteration. Feel free to do a second round of betas, but the alpha, you really wouldn't recognize it. It's a pile sitting on the desk, but it proves that your idea will work. And the betas, that's the first time you really kind of pull it all together.
Right. Well, thank you. We're up on time here, but I wanted to first of all thank the panel. Thank you, John. Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Mike, and thank you, Nick, for your time and contribution from your many years of experience. I'll have to do the math, but it's probably 100+ years of experience there. So thank you very much for that. And to the attendees, thank you for joining us. I think we've touched upon a fairly deep subject here in terms of documentation needed. I think there's a couple of things that I'd want to highlight, which is that there's a range of documents, NDA, statements of work, RFQ, but and all of those are going to be needed in quality agreements, are all going to be needed at some stage. But perhaps the first part is to develop a relationship with a partner you can trust, somebody who meets your needs, and then they can help you work through that. Some of them will work in slightly different ways, but that will be a process you can step through together. And the goal for both the contract manufacturer and supplier, as well as the startup, is a successful project. So lean on their experience wherever possible to help you get the best possible solution, best possible product to market. So once again, I thank you all very much for your time, and we will send out the recording later in the day along with contact details, and hopefully we will see you again soon. Thank you.
Thank you
Thank you very much.
Thanks
Thanks,
very much.
everybody.